The story begins not with a bang, but with the quiet, simmering heat of Palermo, Sicily. In the years between the great wars, a city of dazzling light and profound darkness, where the line between the legitimate world and the underworld was not so much blurred, as it was considered irrelevant. It was here, on the 13th of July, 1928, that Tommaso Buscetta was born, not into a legendary mafia dynasty, but into a modest family of glassmakers, a trade that required patience, a steady hand, and an understanding of how to shape something fragile into a thing of value and beauty through the application of intense heat and pressure. A metaphor that would come to define his entire life. The Sicily of his youth was a place still finding its footing in a modernizing world, yet deeply rooted in ancient codes of honor, silence, and vendetta. The island was, for all intents and purposes, a separate kingdom from mainland Italy, with its own unspoken rules, and the most powerful of these rules were enforced by an organization known as Cosa Nostra, our thing. For a young, ambitious, and sharp-witted boy like Tommaso, the Mafia was not a sinister secret society. It was the air he breathed, the invisible hand that guided commerce, politics, and justice. He saw the respected men of his neighborhood, the ones who commanded fear and deference without ever raising their voices, the men who wore fine suits and solved problems that the police could not or would not address. He understood from a very early age that true power did not reside in the gleaming government offices, but in the shadowy backrooms of cafes and in the whispered conversations in the marketplace. This was his education, far more potent than anything he learned in a classroom. The formal education, in fact, ended early for him. He was a restless soul, driven by a desire for a life far grander than that of a craftsman, a life of respect, wealth, and influence. He found his initial path not in the upper echelons of the Mafia, but in the bustling, chaotic world of the black market during the Second World War, a time when survival itself was a form of entrepreneurship. This was his first real taste of the clandestine economy, of moving goods and making deals outside the purview of the law, owning the skills of negotiation, risk, assessment, and trust that would later become his trademarks. It was a lawless time, and in that lawlessness, a young man could make a name for himself. By the time the war ended, Buscetta was no longer a boy. He was a young man who had learned that, in a broken world, one must build one's own structure, and the most robust structure available was Cosa Nostra. His entry into the organization was not a dramatic, cinematic ceremony in those early days, but a gradual process of assimilation, of proving his worth, his loyalty, and his firmitezza, his toughness. He was initiated into a famiglia, a mafia family, and took the sacred oath of omertà, the code of silence that was the very bedrock of the organization. He swore on burning paper, held in his cupped hands, that he would never betray the secrets of Cosa Nostra, that his life belonged to the family, and that he would rather die than become an informant, a Pentito. In that moment, with the smell of burning paper and the weight of ancient words in the air, Tommaso Buscetta ceased to be an individual and became a part of something he believed was eternal, something greater than himself. Little did he know, or perhaps could not even fathom, that decades later, he would be the one to shatter that oath so completely that the very foundations of Cosa Nostra would crack under the weight of his words. The post-war years were a time of unprecedented opportunity for Cosa Nostra and Tommaso Buscetta, with his sharp intellect, innate charisma, and a ruthlessness that was always carefully veiled behind a facade of gentlemanly composure, rose through the ranks with a swiftness that marked him as a man of destiny within the clandestine world. This was the era of the Peacock Revolution, within the Mafia, where the old, rustic, shotgun-wielding guardians of the countryside were being supplanted by a new breed of gangster, urbane, sophisticated, and with a global vision. Buscetta was the very epitome of this new man. He was handsome, impeccably dressed, and possessed a charm that could disarm both men and women, a trait that earned him the nickname Il Bellissimo, the handsome one. But this charm was merely the velvet glove covering an iron fist. His rise was built on a foundation of strategic alliances and a willingness to engage in the most lucrative and violent enterprises of the time. The 1950s and 60s saw him deeply involved in the burgeoning transatlantic drug trade, a business that would generate unimaginable wealth, but would also plant the seeds of the future conflict that would tear Cosa Nostra apart. He became a pivotal figure in the so-called French Connection, the pipeline that funneled Turkish morphine base through Marseille laboratories to be refined into heroin and then shipped to the insatiable markets of North America. Buscetta was not a street-level dealer. He was an orchestrator, a diplomat between different mafia families, a logistical mastermind who understood the intricacies of international shipping, corruption, and money laundering. He moved between Palermo, Naples, Rome, and eventually across the ocean to Brazil and the United States, building a vast, powerful network. His personal life mirrored the complexity and tumult of his professional one. He was a man of deep passions, marrying 3 times and fathering several children, and he loved them with a fierce intensity that existed in a separate compartment from his violent vocation. He accumulated wealth that would have been the envy of any industrialist, living a life of luxury in elegant apartments, throwing lavish parties, and becoming a figure of legend in the underworld. Yet, this golden age was also stained with blood. The period known as the First Mafia War in the early 1960s was a brutal, chaotic struggle for control of Palermo's expanding urban landscape and the drug trade. It was a conflict characterized by ambushes, betrayals, and public massacres, and Buscetta was in the thick of it, a soldier and a strategist for his faction. It was during this war that he fully internalized the Mafia's code of vengeance. The murder of his brother-in-law and mentor, Cesare Manzella, in a car bomb assassination was a profound personal loss, a wound that never truly healed, and one that cemented his belief in the necessity of retaliatory violence. He ordered and participated in killings, believing them to be necessary acts within the logic of his world. However, this war also brought the first major crackdown by the Italian state leading to the famous Catanzaro trial, where hundreds of mafiosi were indicted. Buscetta was among them, but his network and his luck held. He managed to avoid the worst of the sentences, a testament to his carefully constructed web of influence and his ability to operate from the shadows. But the experience was a warning, the first indication that the outside world, the world of judges and laws, could indeed reach into the heart of their secret kingdom. For now, though, Buscetta remained a true believer, a prince of Cosa Nostra, convinced of its righteousness and its power. He saw the organization not as a criminal enterprise, but as a parallel government, a necessary force for order in a chaotic world, and he was one of its most esteemed and effective ambassadors. The golden era, however, was built on a foundation of shifting sands, and the very success of the drug trade that had enriched Buscetta and his generation began to sow the seeds of a corruption so profound it would ultimately poison the soul of Cosa Nostra itself. The astronomical profits from heroin, far exceeding those from traditional rackets like extortion or cigarette smuggling, created a new class of mafiosi, young, insatiably greedy, and frighteningly ambitious. They were the Corleonesi, a faction led by the ruthless ascetic and strategically brilliant Salvatore Riina from the town of Corleone. To these new men, the old mafia codes of honor, respect, and a certain measured approach to violence were seen as sentimental weaknesses, obsolete relics of a bygone era. For them, power was not something to be earned through loyalty and seniority. It was to be seized through absolute, unflinching terror. Buscetta, now a respected and influential figure, watched this transformation with growing alarm and disgust from his various bases of operation, which now included a new life he was building in Brazil. He saw the delicate ecosystem of Cosa Nostra, a system built on a balance of power between families and a council of bosses known as the Commission, being destabilized by the raw, unchecked ambition of Riina and his allies. The Corleonesi did not play by the established rules. They engaged in what was known as lupara bianca, the white shotgun, a practice of making people disappear completely, leaving no body to be found, a tactic designed to sow maximum fear and eliminate any possibility of a traditional vendetta. This was a fundamental violation of the old code, which demanded that a killing be a message, with the body left in public as a warning. To Buscetta, a traditionalist at heart, despite his global operations, this was not just a change in tactics, it was a betrayal of the very essence of what it meant to be a man of honor. It was during this period of escalating tension that Buscetta's own fortunes took a dramatic and personal turn. In 1972, he was arrested in Brazil on international drug trafficking charges. He fought extradition fiercely, but was eventually sent to Italy, where he was convicted and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. It was behind bars, cut off from his power and his family, that he had ample time to contemplate the changing nature of the organization he had dedicated his life to. He began to hear whispers passed between inmates like poisonous smoke of the brutal purges being orchestrated by Riina back in Sicily. He learned of respected old bosses, men he had known for decades, being murdered simply for opposing the Corleonese's methods or for standing in their path to absolute dominion. The Mafia was no longer the honorable society he had joined. It was becoming a monstrous, self-cannibalizing entity. After several years in Italian prisons, he was eventually extradited to the United States to face separate charges, and there, in an American jail, he received the news that would shatter his world and extinguish the last flicker of his loyalty to Cosa Nostra. In the span of a brutally short time, dozens of his closest friends, allies, and, most devastatingly, his own blood relatives, including 2 of his sons, Antonio and Benedetto, were systematically hunted down and murdered on the orders of Salvatore Riina. This was not war, this was annihilation. This was the Corleonese consolidating power by eradicating entire lineages, a scorched earth policy that left no room for negotiation or mercy. For Tommaso Buscetta, the man who lived by the code of family and honor, this was an unforgivable sin. The organization had not just changed. It had become the very thing it was supposed to stand against. It had become a tyranny that devoured its own. And in the deep, silent darkness of his prison cell, a profound and revolutionary thought began to take root in his mind. Perhaps the oath of omertà did not apply to a Cosa Nostra that had so utterly betrayed its own principles. Perhaps the only form of vendetta left was the most unthinkable one of all. The decision to break a lifelong oath is not made in a single, dramatic moment, but in the slow, crushing accumulation of loss and the profound realization that the world you believed in was a beautiful, terrible lie. For Tommaso Buscetta, languishing in a high-security American prison, isolated and stripped of his power, the murders of his sons and his friends were not just personal tragedies, they were a philosophical cataclysm. The code of omertà, the sacred vow of silence that had been the bedrock of his identity, was predicated on a reciprocal relationship. The organization protected you and your family, and in return, you offered it your unwavering loyalty, even unto death. But Riina's Cosa Nostra had violated this sacred contract. It had become a predatory beast that consumed its own children. In this desolate landscape of grief and rage, the traditional recourse of vengeance was impossible. He was in a cage, and his enemies held all the power outside. His only weapon, his only remaining form of vendetta, was knowledge. And so, through a circuitous and cautious route, he sent a message to the authorities. He indicated his willingness to talk. This was not a surrender to the state in his mind. It was a declaration of war against the traitors who had hijacked his Cosa Nostra. The man chosen to receive this seismic communication was an Italian magistrate named Giovanni Falcone, a Sicilian himself, a man of sharp intellect, unwavering courage, and a deep, almost intuitive understanding of the Mafia's labyrinthine mind. The initial contacts were fraught with mutual suspicion. Buscetta, the master manipulator, was testing the waters, probing Falcone's intentions and integrity. He would not speak to just anyone. He demanded a man of honor, even if that man was his juridical enemy. Falcone, on the other hand, was navigating the minefield of dealing with a man responsible for countless crimes, a man whose word was, by definition, treacherous. Their first meetings, held under conditions of extreme secrecy, were a clash of two formidable intellects. Falcone did not offer Buscetta leniency or a reduced sentence immediately. Instead, he offered something far more compelling to a man like Buscetta: respect and a genuine desire to understand. Falcone listened. He did not just interrogate, he engaged in a dialogue. He asked Buscetta not just for names and dates, but for the philosophy, the structure, the very soul of Cosa Nostra. And Buscetta, seeing in Falcone a worthy adversary, and perhaps the only instrument through which his vengeance could be achieved, began to talk. He started not with the crimes, but with the initiation ritual, describing the burning paper, the oath, the pinprick of blood, the sacred moment of birth into the organization. He was, in effect, providing Falcone with a Rosetta Stone for deciphering the Mafia. He explained the complex hierarchy, the famiglie, the capodecina, the capomandamento, the commission. He detailed the rules, the protocols for communication, the intricate web of relationships and alliances. He was not merely snitching. He was delivering a comprehensive anthropological and sociological study of a secret society, a dissertation on power from its former prince. This was the first step, the unlocking of the door. But the real explosion, the testimony that would shake Italy to its core, was still to come. It would require a leap of faith from both men. Buscetta trusting the state to protect him and his remaining family, and Falcone trusting that this man, a master of deception, was now telling the ultimate truth. The transfer of Tommaso Buscetta from American custody into the hands of Giovanni Falcone was an operation of military precision and utmost secrecy, a necessary precaution against the long and vengeful arm of the Corleonesi, who would have moved heaven and earth to silence him before a single word could be formally recorded. Upon arriving in Italy, Buscetta was immediately plunged into a new kind of prison, one of sterile safe houses, constant movement, and a life stripped of all identity, existing only as a voice, a repository of secrets waiting to be emptied. It was during these intense, marathon interrogation sessions, often lasting 10 or 12 hours a day, that the unique partnership between the mafioso and the magistrate truly solidified. Falcone, armed with immense patience and a preternatural calm, would sit with Buscetta, often sharing meals with him, creating a semblance of normalcy in an utterly abnormal situation. He understood that to extract the full truth, he needed to build a bridge of trust, to treat Buscetta not as a monster, but as a key witness to a history that had never been told from the inside. Buscetta, for his part, laid down his conditions. He would speak only of Cosa Nostra, of the Mafia as an organization, and of the crimes it committed as an entity. He would not talk about common criminals, political figures, unless they were directly involved with the Mafia, or any activities outside the purview of the honored society. This was a crucial distinction for him, a way to maintain a shred of his own twisted honor, to frame his actions not as a common informant seeking personal gain, but as a righteous crusader against the heresy that had consumed his world. Falcone agreed, recognizing the strategic value of this focused approach. And so, the floodgates opened. Buscetta began to dictate his testament, a sprawling, detailed confession that wove together the entire tapestry of the Sicilian Mafia from the 1950s to the early 1980s. He named names, hundreds of them, from low-level soldiers to powerful bosses who moved in the highest circles of Italian society. He described the inner workings of the commission, the mafia's ruling body, identifying its members and detailing how they voted on murders, sanctioned wars, and divided territories. He provided the motive and the organizational approval for countless killings that had previously been written off as isolated acts of violence, connecting them to a grand, unified strategy of power consolidation. He spoke of the intricacies of the international drug trade, explaining the routes, the partnerships, and the mind-boggling financial flows. But his most devastating testimony, the core of his vendetta, was reserved for the Corleonesi and their leader, Salvatore Riina. He detailed their ruthless rise, their strategy of systematic assassination, their violation of every rule that had once governed the mafia. He provided the context and the organizational mandate for the murders of his own sons, framing them not as personal tragedies alone, but as evidence of a criminal coup within Cosa Nostra. This was not just a list of crimes, it was a historical narrative, a philosophical treatise on the corruption of power. Falcone and his small, trusted team worked tirelessly, cross-referencing every name, every date, every location Buscetta provided, building a massive, corroborated body of evidence. They discovered that Buscetta's memory was near photographic, his recall of events from decades past stunningly precise. This first phase of testimony, conducted in secret, resulted in thousands of pages of transcripts, a foundational document that would become the bedrock for the most significant anti-mafia prosecution in Italian history. It was the calm before the storm, the meticulous loading of the cannon that would soon be fired directly at the heart of the criminal empire. The immense, secret body of work compiled by Falcone and his team from Buscetta's testimony now required a vessel, a legal framework bold enough and strong enough to contain its explosive power. That vessel became known as the Maxi-Trial, a judicial undertaking of unprecedented scale and ambition that would forever change the relationship between the Italian state and the mafia. The legal foundation for this colossal effort was a revolutionary piece of legislation, a direct result of the insights provided by Buscetta. It was understood that trying mafiosi for individual murders was a futile, whack-mole exercise. The organization itself had to be put on trial. The new law defined the mafia as a single, unified criminal organization, and membership in it as a serious crime in and of itself. This was a conceptual leap made possible by Buscetta's detailed map of Cosa Nostra's structure and his testimony to its existence as a formal entity, not just a loose collection of gangs. To host this historic trial, a massive, bomb-proof bunker courtroom was constructed inside the Uscerdone prison in Palermo, a symbolic and practical necessity given the very real threat of assassination. The stage was set for a legal spectacle unlike any other. The indictments named 474 defendants, a veritable who's who of the Sicilian Mafia, including its most powerful and feared bosses, many of whom had never been formally photographed and were known only as whispered legends. At the center of it all, both literally and figuratively, was the testimony of Tommaso Buscetta. His decision to testify in open court, even from a protected witness stand and with his voice distorted, was a moment of supreme drama and danger. It was one thing to talk in a secret safe house. It was another to publicly, formally, and legally break the oath of omertà in front of his former brothers, to become in their eyes the ultimate in fame, the traitor. When he finally spoke in the bunker courtroom, his calm, measured tone, laced with a palpable undercurrent of sorrow and defiance, held the entire nation in thrall. He was not a frightened man begging for mercy. He was a prosecutor in his own right, methodically, coldly, and devastatingly laying out the entire architecture of Cosa Nostra for the judges to see. He identified defendants by name, described their roles, linked them to specific murders and criminal conspiracies. The defense strategy, orchestrated by some of Italy's most skilled and flamboyant lawyers, was one of relentless attack on Buscetta's character. They painted him as a murderer, a drug trafficker, a man motivated solely by a thirst for revenge after losing his power struggle, a Pentito who was singing only to save his own skin and take his enemies down with him. They tried to trip him up on minor details, to expose contradictions, to brand him as the Prince of Lies. But Buscetta, under Falcone's careful preparation, remained largely unshakable. His deep knowledge of the Mafia's inner workings, his ability to explain not just the what, but the why of its actions, gave his testimony a coherence and a credibility that simple facts alone could not provide. He was not just giving evidence, he was giving the court a narrative, a story so compelling and internally consistent that it withstood the legal onslaught. The trial dragged on for months, a grueling marathon of legal arguments, witness testimonies, and dramatic confrontations. Throughout it all, Buscetta's presence, even when he was not physically in the room, loomed over the proceedings. He had handed the state the sword, and Giovanni Falcone and his colleagues were now wielding it in a battle that would determine whether the rule of law could truly triumph over the rule of the gun and the lupara. The conclusion of the Maxi-Trial in December 1987 sent shockwaves across Italy and the entire world, a seismic event in the history of criminal justice. After 22 months of proceedings, the three-judge panel, having sifted through thousands of pages of evidence and testimony, delivered its verdicts. The results were staggering: 342 convictions, including 19 life sentences, handed down to some of the most powerful and untouchable mafia bosses in Sicily. It was an unprecedented victory for the state, a body blow to Cosa Nostra that demonstrated, for the first time, that the organization was not invincible, that its members could be held accountable in a court of law. The symbolic power of seeing these feared men, these shadows who had ruled through terror, being sentenced from a cage in a courtroom, was immeasurable. And at the heart of every single conviction, like a structural beam, running through the entire legal edifice, was the testimony of Tommaso Buscetta. He had been proven right. His knowledge was the key that had unlocked the door. For Giovanni Falcone and the anti-mafia pool of magistrates, it was a moment of historic vindication, a validation of their years of dangerous, painstaking work. For the Italian public, it was a moment of cautious hope, a belief that perhaps the tide was finally turning. But for Cosa Nostra, and especially for the Corleonesi faction, led by Salvatore Riina, the verdict was not a defeat to be accepted. It was a declaration of total war against the state. The mafia's response was swift, brutal, and intended to terrorize the nation into submission. They could not immediately reach Buscetta, who was now hidden deep within a witness protection program, his identity erased, his life transformed into a ghostly existence of constant movement and guarded secrecy. So they targeted the symbols of the state's victory. The first and most devastating blow fell on May 23, 1992. Giovanni Falcone, his wife Francesca Morvillo, and 3 police officers were murdered on the highway near Capaci, Sicily, when a massive bomb, planted in a culvert and remotely detonated, obliterated their motorcade. The explosion was so powerful it registered on local seismographs. The assassination was not just a murder. It was an execution and a message no one, no matter how powerful or protected, was beyond their reach. The entire nation was plunged into mourning and rage. Just 57 days later, on July 19, 1992, Falcone's closest friend and colleague, Magistrate Paolo Borsellino, along with 5 members of his police escort, was killed by a car bomb in Via D'Amelio in Palermo. The twin massacres were Cosa Nostra's furious answer to the Maxi-Trial, a demonstration that they would respond to the rule of law with the rule of terror. For Tommaso Buscetta, living in his invisible prison of protection, the news of these murders, particularly Falcone's, was a cataclysmic personal blow. The man he had trusted, the man who had understood him, was gone, murdered by the very beasts he had sought to expose. It must have felt like his great vendetta had come at a price too horrifying to comprehend, and that the monster, though wounded, was far from dead. The hope born from the Maxi-Trial now seemed extinguished, replaced by a deeper, more profound darkness. In the grim aftermath of the assassinations of Falcone and Borsellino, a collective fury seized the Italian people and the remnants of its courageous judiciary. The state, humiliated and enraged by the audacity of these attacks, launched an unprecedented military and judicial counter-offensive. Thousands of soldiers were sent to Sicily, and the police were given sweeping powers to hunt down the mafia leadership. It was in this climate of national resolve and desperate need for justice that Tommaso Buscetta, once again, emerged from the shadows of his protected existence. The loss of Falcone was a profound personal wound, but it also hardened his resolve. If his testimony had been the first blow, then his voice would now be the final nail in the coffin of the Corleonesi. He agreed to testify again, this time in a series of new, targeted trials aimed specifically at convicting the perpetrators of these high-level assassinations and, most importantly, at finally capturing the elusive Salvatore Riina. Buscetta's knowledge of mafia protocols and strategic thinking was once again invaluable. He helped prosecutors understand the chain of command, the likely planners, and the symbolic significance of the attacks. He explained that such monumental decisions, to assassinate two of the state's most prominent symbols, could only have been taken by the very top of the organization, by the commission and its de facto leader, Riina. His testimony provided the crucial connective tissue that linked the remote, controlled bombs to the shadowy figures in the ruling committee. But his contribution in this phase went beyond specific trials. Buscetta became a philosophical guide for a new generation of magistrates, a living archive of mafia mentality. He reiterated his central thesis: the Cosa Nostra of the Corleonesi was a cancerous deviation, a betrayal of the older, more honorable codes that had, in his view, at least maintained a balance and avoided such direct, catastrophic confrontations with the state. He was not just providing evidence, he was providing a moral and historical framework for the fight, justifying the state's war by framing it as a battle against an illegitimate, monstrous tyranny. This period also saw him testifying in the Pizza Connection trial in the United States, further dismantling the international heroin network he had once helped build. His cooperation was now total, a lifelong commitment to his chosen path of vengeance. The pressure on the mafia was immense, and it began to yield results. The most significant of these was the arrest of Salvatore, the Beast, Riina in Palermo on January 15, 1993, after 23 years as a fugitive. His capture at a quiet traffic stop was a direct consequence of the state's intensified campaign, a campaign built upon the foundation of knowledge that Buscetta had provided. For Buscetta, this was the ultimate vindication, the moment his long and treacherous path reached its primary objective. The man who had ordered the murders of his sons, who had hijacked his Cosa Nostra, and who had plunged Sicily into a river of blood, was now in a cage. It was a symbolic end to his personal war, a closure that few in his world ever received. Yet, the victory was bittersweet, shadowed by the memory of the great cost, the lives of Falcone, Borsellino, his own children, and countless others. He had won his vendetta, but he was now a ghost, a man without a country, without a past, and with a future that promised only more hiding, more looking over his shoulder, forever severed from the world he once knew. With Salvatore Riina finally captured and imprisoned, Tommaso Buscetta's primary mission, his great vendetta, was technically complete. Yet, the man who had set in motion an irreversible process found there was no rest for him, no peaceful retirement into anonymity. He had become a permanent asset to the state, a foundational source whose knowledge continued to be mined for new trials and new understandings of the ever-evolving mafia. His life in the Witness Protection Program in the United States was a paradox of safety and profound isolation. He was given a new identity, a new history, and a new home in some anonymous American suburb, a world away from the vibrant, chaotic streets of Palermo that were etched into his soul. He lived surrounded by armed guards, a prisoner of the state he had chosen to assist, his every movement monitored, his every contact controlled. For a man of his charisma, his large appetites, and his deep familial bonds, this existence was a special kind of hell, a price he paid every day for his survival and his principles. He could never again casually chat with a neighbor, never form a genuine friendship without the shadow of his past and the looming threat of discovery, never visit the graves of his murdered loved ones in Sicily. He was a living ghost, and the weight of his decisions, the totality of his loss, must have been a constant, crushing presence. During these years, he granted a series of extensive interviews to the journalist Enzo Biaggi, which were later published, providing a more philosophical and reflective account of his life and choices. In these conversations, he never expressed remorse for his crimes as a mafioso. Instead, he consistently framed his entire life's narrative as a tragedy caused by the betrayal of the Corleonesi. He saw himself as a man of honor who had been forced into an unholy alliance with the legal system to combat a greater evil. This was his enduring justification, the story he told himself to be able to live with the consequences of his actions. He watched from afar as the Italian state, armed with the legal tools and understanding he had helped create, continued its fight, convicting Riina and his lieutenants for the murders of Falcone and Borsellino, and systematically dismantling the economic power of the mafia through confiscation of its vast assets. He also witnessed, with a certain grim satisfaction, the internal chaos that his actions had precipitated within Cosa Nostra. The phenomenon of Pentismo that he had started became a flood. Dozens, then hundreds, of mafiosi. Seeing the organization weakened and the state now offering protection, followed his example and began to collaborate, further fracturing the once impenetrable wall of omertà. He had not just provided evidence, he had created a precedent, a path that others could follow, fundamentally altering the psychological dynamics between the mafia and its members. The organization was forced to spend as much time rooting out potential informants from within as it did fighting the state from without. This was perhaps his most enduring legacy, the destruction of the myth of mafia invincibility and unity from the inside. But for Buscetta, the man, these were abstract victories. His daily reality was one of memory and loss, a quiet, guarded existence waiting for an end that he knew could still come violently. A final revenge from the world he had so spectacularly abandoned. The final years of Tommaso Buscetta's life were a study in quiet contradiction, a long, slow fade in the sterile safety of his American exile, a world away from the sun-drenched intensity and visceral dangers of his Sicilian past. He lived out his days under the watchful eyes of his U.S. Marshals protectors, a man whose name had become synonymous with one of the most significant upheavals in the history of organized crime, yet who now inhabited a life of enforced blandness and profound isolation, the fiery, charismatic Bellissimo, who had commanded rooms and orchestrated international drug deals, was now a graying, ailing man in his 70s, navigating the anonymous aisles of American supermarkets, his legendary past known only to a handful of government handlers. he spent his time reading, following news from Italy with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow, and reflecting on the colossal arc of his existence. The cancer that had first appeared years earlier, a physical manifestation of the turmoil that had always raged within him, returned with a vengeance. It was in a New York hospital, far from the land of his birth and the scene of his greatest triumphs and tragedies, that he faced his final days. He died on April 2, 2000, at the age of 71, not from a mafia bullet or a car bomb, but from the slow, inexorable progress of disease. His death, like his life after becoming a Pentito, was shrouded in secrecy. His location and his new identity were protected to the very end, a final, necessary precaution, even in death, against the long, unforgiving memory of Cosa Nostra. His passing was met with a complex mixture of reactions. In Italy, he was remembered as a figure of immense historical significance. The man who had broken the code and opened the floodgates, yet also as a complicated and morally ambiguous character. A murderer who had sought a form of redemption through a greater betrayal. For the families of his many victims, his death likely brought no comfort, only a reminder of the irreversible loss he had directly or indirectly caused. For the mafia he had betrayed, his natural death was a frustration. They had been denied the ultimate vengeance of killing him themselves. For the magistrates and police who had worked with him, he was a pivotal, if deeply flawed, partner in a necessary war. His legacy is not a simple one to untangle. He was not a hero in the conventional sense. He was a man of violence and crime who, when pushed beyond a personal and ethical breaking point, used his knowledge as a weapon of immense destructive power against his own world. He did not collaborate out of a sudden moral awakening or loyalty to the state, but out of a very old-fashioned mafia motive, a consuming, relentless vendetta for the murder of his family. Yet, the consequences of his actions transcended his personal motives. He provided the world with the first true, comprehensive insider's view of Cosa Nostra, demystifying it and providing the legal and intellectual tools to fight it effectively. He created the template for the modern Pentito, showing that it was possible to break the oath and survive, thereby irrevocably damaging the psychological hold of omertà. The Maxi-Trial and the subsequent investigations, his testimony, enabled crippled the Sicilian Mafia's old guard and led to the capture of its most brutal leader. His life stands as a stark reminder that the most damaging blows to a secret society often come not from outside forces, but from a betrayal from within, from a man who knew all its secrets and decided to use them as his final and most powerful weapon. The psychological portrait of Tommaso Buscetta is a labyrinth of contradictions, a study of a man who held two entirely opposing realities within his mind and managed to navigate them both with a chilling conviction. To understand his decision to become a Pentito, one must first abandon the notion of a simple conversion from evil to good. For Buscetta, his entire life was governed by a personal, albeit twisted, code of honor. The Cosa Nostra he joined in his youth was, in his perception, an organization of order, a necessary shadow government, that provided structure and justice in a world where the official state was often absent, corrupt, or incompetent. It was a society with rules, traditions, and a deep sense of loyalty to one's own. His initial crimes, from black market dealings to murder, were not, in his mind, acts of mere criminality, but acts in service of this parallel society, sanctioned by its laws and necessary for its survival and his own rise within it. He was a true believer, a romantic even, in love with the idea of the honorable gangster. The rise of the Corleonesi under Riina was, therefore, not just a shift in power, it was a profound spiritual and philosophical crisis for him. He saw their methods, the indiscriminate slaughter of women and children, the lupara bianca that left no body for burial, the betrayal of the very rules of war, as a form of sacrilege. It was a descent into barbarism that corrupted the very soul of the institution he revered. The murder of his sons was the ultimate, unforgivable transgression. It was not merely a personal loss. It was a violation of the foundational principle that the family was sacred, that wars were fought between men of honor, not against their innocent children. This act proved to him that the Cosa Nostra he had loved was dead, replaced by a monstrous entity that had to be destroyed. His collaboration, then, was not a betrayal of his code, but its ultimate fulfillment. He was enacting the most fundamental of mafia principles, the vendetta. Since he could not defeat the Corleonesi from within using their own methods, he would use the only weapon left to him, the truth. He rationalized his cooperation with the state by framing Giovanni Falcone not as a representative of a legitimate government he had always scorned, but as a worthy adversary, a man of honor in his own sphere, a knight he could align with to defeat a common, monstrous enemy. This allowed him to maintain a coherent sense of self. He never expressed public remorse for his many victims from the old mafia days. Those killings were, to him, justified within the logic of that time. His war was solely against the new heresy. This intricate mental framework is what allowed him to sit calmly in a courtroom and detail murders he had ordered or carried out, all while believing in his own essential righteousness. He was not a man torn by guilt, but a man driven by a burning, all-consuming sense of injustice perpetrated against him, and his idealized vision of Cosa Nostra. He was the last true believer, and his testimony was his final, devastating excommunication of the false prophets who had taken over his church. The legacy of Tommaso Buscetta extends far beyond the courtrooms and the court transcripts. It seeped into the very fabric of Italian society, law, and popular culture, forever altering the perception and reality of the mafia's place in the modern world. His decision to speak created a seismic shift in the collective consciousness, both for the public and for the mafiosi themselves. For decades, Cosa Nostra had been a mythic, almost supernatural force, a subject of fear, whispered about but never truly confronted. Buscetta demystified it by meticulously explaining its structure, its rituals, its finances, and its internal politics. He transformed the mafia from a spectral legend into a tangible criminal corporation, something that could be understood, analyzed, and therefore fought. He gave the enemy a face, a name, and an organizational chart. This demystification was a crucial step in mobilizing public opinion and political will for a sustained fight. The Italian state, armed with his testimony, was forced to evolve its tactics, moving from a reactive approach to individual crimes to a proactive strategy of targeting the organization as a whole, a strategy that culminated in the revolutionary legal framework of the Maxi-Trial. The concept of association for the purpose of trafficking narcotics, for instance, became a powerful tool directly linked to the insights he provided about their international operations. Furthermore, Buscetta's very existence as a protected witness created a tangible path for others. He proved that it was possible to break the oath of omertà and not only survive, but to wield a power greater than any gun. The power to bring down one's enemies from within the system. The flood of Pentiti that followed in his wake, men like Salvatore Contorno and Antonino Calderone, can be directly traced to the precedent he set. They saw that the state could, in fact, offer protection, and that collaboration was a viable, if treacherous, option. This shattered the aura of invincibility and unbreakable loyalty that Cosa Nostra had so carefully cultivated. Internally, this created a climate of paranoia and suspicion from which the organization has never fully recovered. The cultural impact was equally profound. His story became the template for countless books, films, and television series around the world, shaping the global narrative of the mafia informant. The archetype of the high-ranking insider who turns state's evidence, motivated by a complex mix of vengeance and a twisted moral code, finds its purest expression in Buscetta. He forced Italy to look in the mirror and confront the ugly reality of the cancer within its society, sparking a national conversation that continues to this day. While he was undoubtedly a monster who committed heinous crimes, his later actions inadvertently empowered the forces of law and order, providing them with the intellectual and legal weapons they had previously lacked. The story of Tommaso Buscetta is, therefore, not a simple morality tale of good versus evil, but a far more complex and unsettling story about how the destruction of a criminal empire was ultimately achieved not by a saint, but by one of its own most devoted sinners, a man who, in seeking a very personal vengeance, accidentally served a far greater one. To fully grasp the cataclysmic impact of Tommaso Buscetta's decision, one must understand the world he left behind in Sicily, a world forever scarred and irrevocably changed by his testimony. The mafia that emerged in the aftermath of the Maxi-Trial and the subsequent arrests was a wounded, mutated beast, forced to adapt to a new reality where its secrecy was compromised and its ranks were infiltrated by the ever-present fear of the next Pentito. The old hierarchies, so meticulously detailed by Buscetta, became liabilities. The powerful commission that had once ruled with impunity was dismantled, its members either in prison or on the run. The elaborate initiation rituals, the very heart of the organization's identity, were simplified or abandoned in many areas to reduce the risk of exposure, severing the sacred bond that had once united men of honor. the mafia was forced to decentralize, becoming a more fragmented, cellular organization, less glamorous and more business-like, focusing on infiltrating the legitimate economy and public works contracts with a quiet, insidious persistence rather than the spectacular violence of the Riina years. This was not a sign of defeat, but a strategic retreat into the shadows, a recognition that the methods of the 1980s had brought too much heat. The Corleonesi's strategy of direct confrontation with the state had backfired spectacularly, largely because of the legal and intellectual weapons provided by Buscetta. The organization's greatest strength, its code of silence, had been broken, and it could never be fully restored. The very language of Cosa Nostra changed. The word Pentito, once the most vile insult, became a common and terrifying part of the mafioso's vocabulary, a ghost haunting every meeting, a suspicion coloring every relationship. The Italian state, for its part, also evolved. The witness protection program, once a rudimentary concept, became a sophisticated apparatus, encouraging more defections. Laws allowing for the confiscation of mafia assets, used with great effect after the Maxi-Trial, became a primary weapon, attacking the organization's lifeblood, its money. The murders of Falcone and Borsellino, while a temporary victory for the mafia, ultimately galvanized a permanent anti-mafia movement within civil society, with citizens' groups, schools, and businesses increasingly refusing to pay the pizzo, the protection money that had been the organization's financial bedrock for a century. This cultural shift, this widespread social rejection, was perhaps the most enduring damage of all. And it was a direct consequence of the awareness that Buscetta's revelations had sparked. The people of Sicily were no longer willing to live in fear of a myth. They were now fighting a known enemy. The landscape of power in Sicily had been permanently altered. The political protections that the mafia had enjoyed for decades became far more difficult to maintain as the spotlight of justice, ignited by Buscetta's testimony, burned ever brighter. He had not destroyed the mafia. It proved to be a resilient parasite, but he had broken its back, exposed its workings, and forever ended its golden age of untouchable dominance. The Sicily of today, with its active anti-mafia prosecutors and its vocal civil society, exists in a world that Tommaso Buscetta, in his quest for a very personal vengeance, helped to create. The final, lingering question that surrounds the figure of Tommaso Buscetta, a question that echoes long after the courtrooms have fallen silent and the headlines have faded, is one of redemption. Can a man responsible for so much suffering, for ordering and participating in countless murders, for trafficking in a poison that destroyed innumerable lives, ever truly be redeemed? The answer is as complex and morally ambiguous as the man himself. Buscetta never sought redemption in a religious or societal sense. He never publicly expressed remorse for the victims of his early crimes, those killed under the banner of the old Cosa Nostra he so revered. His justification remained steadfast until the end. He was a soldier in a war, and those deaths were casualties of that conflict, sanctioned by the code he lived by. His war was not against crime, but against a specific corrupted faction within his own criminal world. His collaboration was not an act of penance, but an act of vengeance, the purest and most traditional motive within the mafia ethos. Therefore, to view his later life as a story of redemption is to misunderstand his fundamental character. He did not become a good man. He remained a man of honor by his own twisted definition to the very end. The good that came from his actions, the crippling of a murderous organization, the empowerment of the state, the inspiration for a social movement, was, in a sense, a historical accident, a byproduct of his personal crusade. Yet, it is impossible to ignore the monumental positive consequences that flowed from his decision. He provided the keys to a prison that had held Sicily captive for generations. He gave the families of victims, those killed by the Corleonese's reign of terror, a form of justice they could never have otherwise obtained. He saved future lives by disrupting the mafia's operations and making it a less potent and more paranoid entity. In the cold calculus of history, his actions resulted in a net good for society, even if his motivations were entirely self-serving and rooted in the very violence he claimed to despise. Perhaps, then, his story offers a different, more challenging lesson, that in the fight against profound evil, the agents of change are not always pure-hearted heroes. Sometimes they are flawed, compromised, and monstrous individuals whose personal grievances align, for a fleeting moment, with the cause of justice. Buscetta's legacy is not one of personal redemption, but of a catastrophic and necessary betrayal. He is a figure who forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the tools to dismantle a hellish system are sometimes found in the hands of those who helped to build it. He found his own peace not in God or in society's forgiveness, but in the knowledge that he had settled his accounts, that he had won his vendetta against the men who had destroyed his family and his idealized vision of the honorable society. For Tommaso Buscetta, that was the only redemption he ever wanted or needed. To truly appreciate the depth of Tommaso Buscetta's betrayal, one must delve into the very heart of the secret world he exposed, a world governed by a language and a logic entirely its own, a world he translated for the first time for the bewildered ears of the state. Before Buscetta, the mafia was a ghost. Magistrates knew it existed. They saw its bloody handiwork, but they could not grasp its substance. They lacked the vocabulary to describe its anatomy. Buscetta provided that vocabulary. He explained the concept of stare testa coperta, to stand with a covered head, meaning to remain silent, to deny everything. He detailed the sippo, the act of killing a man by shooting him in the back of the neck, a signature mafia execution. He described the lupara bianca, the white shotgun, the practice of making a body disappear completely, a tool of psychological terror perfected by the Corleonese. But his most profound revelations were structural. He laid bare the cellular organization of Cosa Nostra, the famiglia or cosca, the basic unit led by a capofamiglia, the capadicina, a captain commanding a group of 10 soldiers, the capomandamento, a district boss representing a group of families on the provincial commission. He explained how this commission, or cupola, functioned as a ruling directorate, settling disputes, authorizing murders, and coordinating strategy. He detailed the intricate initiation ritual, the batesimo, where the novice would have his finger pricked. The blood dripped onto a sacred image, usually a saint, which was then set on fire. As the novice passed the burning card from hand to hand, he would swear the oath, "May my flesh burn like this saint if I betray the organization." This was the sacred moment Buscetta himself had undergone, and the moment he now profaned with his testimony. He explained the rules of communication, how mafiosi from different families could only interact through their respective bosses, a system designed to maintain security and hierarchy. He revealed the existence of the pizzini, the tiny, coded handwritten notes used to communicate between bosses in prison, a system that would later be famously used by Bernardo Provenzano. He gave context to the violence, explaining that a murder was never just a murder, it was an execution, an execution, sanctioned by the internal justice system. A body left in a car trunk with its genitals in its mouth was a message about the victim's sexual misconduct. A killing in a public place was a deliberate message to the community. By providing this dictionary and this cultural context, Buscetta did more than just give evidence. He gave the state a lens through which to interpret decades of unsolved crimes and mysterious behaviors. He transformed random, senseless acts of violence into a coherent, if horrifying, narrative of power, politics, and punishment. He turned the mafia from a myth into a bureaucracy of death, and in doing so, made it vulnerable. For the first time, the hunters could think like the hunted, anticipate their moves, and understand their motivations. This intellectual conquest, this demystification through language and structure, was arguably even more damaging to Cosa Nostra than the specific convictions it produced, for it stripped them of their most powerful weapon, after violence, their secrecy. The life of Tommaso Buscetta in the Witness Protection Program in the United States was a profound and paradoxical exile, a twilight existence that was both a sanctuary and a prison of the soul. Granted a new identity, he was transplanted into the bland anonymity of American suburbia, a world of neatly trimmed lawns and quiet cull, sacks that could not have been further from the passionate, volatile, and deeply personal world of Palermo. His days were governed by a strict routine of security protocols. He lived in houses specially selected and often modified by the U.S. Marshals. His movements were monitored, his contacts vetted. He could not hold a normal job, form genuine friendships, or ever truly let his guard down. The man who had once commanded a global network, who had dined in fine restaurants and moved through the world with the confidence of a prince, was now a ghost, his existence reduced to a series of safe rooms and supervised outings. The psychological toll of this isolation was immense. He was a man of immense charisma and strong family bonds, now severed from everything and everyone he had ever known. He was haunted not only by the constant, gnawing fear of discovery and revenge, a fear that was entirely justified, as Cosa Nostra never forgets a traitor and had a long reach, but also by the ghosts of his past, The memories of his murdered sons, of his fallen friends, of the life of power and respect he had once enjoyed, must have played in his mind on an endless, torturous loop. He spent his time reading, following Italian news from a distance, and reflecting on the colossal arc of his life. In his later years, he granted interviews to a select few journalists, his voice often filled with a deep, melancholic resignation. He never wavered in his justification for what he had done. But there was a palpable sense of sorrow for the path his life had taken. He had achieved his vengeance, but at the cost of his very identity. He was no longer Tommaso Buscetta. He was a number in a federal system, a case file, a secret. The cancer that eventually took his life was a physical manifestation of the turmoil that had always raged within him. His death in a New York hospital in the year 2000 was a quiet, clinical end for a man who had lived a life of operatic drama. There was no dramatic shootout, no mafia-style execution, just the slow, inexorable fate of a sick old man in a sterile room, far from the land of his birth. It was an ending that seemed almost anti-climactic for the man who had set in motion the chain of events that led to the Maxi-Trial and the capture of Riina. Yet, in its own way, it was the final, fitting chapter of his life as a Pentito, a death in hiding, a final secret kept by the state that had protected him, a final victory over the organization that had sworn to see his flesh burn. He was buried in an unmarked grave under his assumed name, a final layer of anonymity protecting him even in death, the ultimate symbol of a life utterly consumed by and ultimately sacrificed to his great betrayal. The story of Tommaso Buscetta is ultimately a Greek tragedy played out on a modern stage, a saga of a man whose own defining qualities, his fierce loyalty, his rigid code of honor, his capacity for deep love for his family, became the very instruments of his downfall and the catalysts for his world-altering betrayal. He was a classic tragic hero, a man of high stature in his own realm, whose fatal flaw was his unwavering belief in the idealized version of Cosa Nostra. This hubris led him to underestimate the nihilistic ambition of men like Riina, who saw his codes as weaknesses to be exploited. His peripeteia, his sudden reversal of fortune, was not a single event, but a series of devastating losses, the murders of his sons, his brothers, his friends, the systematic destruction of his lineage. This forced upon him a terrible anagnorisis, a moment of shocking recognition. The society he had dedicated his life to was not what he believed it to be. It was not a noble, parallel state. It was a savage, self-cannibalizing beast that had turned on its own. His collaboration, therefore, was his form of tragic resolution, the only action left that was consistent with his own twisted sense of honor. It was a catharsis of vengeance, but one that demanded the complete annihilation of his old self. He could not simply defeat his enemies. He had to destroy the entire world that had created them, and in doing so, he destroyed the world that had created him. He is a figure who forces us to confront uncomfortable moral ambiguities. He was not an innocent man wronged by the system. He was a willing and enthusiastic architect of that system for most of his life. His later actions, while producing immense societal good, were not motivated by a desire for that good, but by a very personal, almost primal, need for retribution. This complexity is what makes his story so enduring and so compelling. It resists easy categorization. He is neither hero nor villain, but something far more human and far more terrifying, a man of profound contradictions, capable of great love and great violence, of unwavering loyalty and the ultimate treachery. His life stands as a dark mirror to Sicily itself, reflecting its beauty and its brutality, its deep family bonds and its culture of vendetta, its romanticism and its harsh realities. He was, in many ways, the last of his kind, the last great traditional mafioso, and his decision to speak was the act that formally ended that era. The mafia that survived him was a colder, more corporate, less romantic entity. In the end, Tommaso Buscetta's most significant legacy may be that he provided the world with the ultimate insider's look into a secret society, not through the eyes of a journalist or a sociologist, but through the eyes of one of its most devoted and disillusioned high priests. He gave us the story from the inside, with all its bloody glory and its tragic, inevitable downfall. The long, dark shadow cast by Tommaso Buscetta's life and decisions stretches far into the present, influencing not only the ongoing fight against organized crime in Italy, but also the global understanding of how to combat secretive, powerful criminal societies. His legacy is a living one, studied by law enforcement agencies from Colombia to Japan, from Russia to Mexico, as the seminal case study in how to turn a high-value insider. The strategy he pioneered, offering protection, a new identity, and a platform for vengeance in exchange for a complete and total dismantling of the organization from within, has become a standard tool in the arsenal of states worldwide facing similar threats. The Buscetta model demonstrated that the most impregnable criminal fortresses are vulnerable not to frontal assault, but to a betrayal from their inner sanctum. In Italy itself, the institution of the Pentito that he legitimized, however controversially, remains a cornerstone of anti-mafia prosecutions. Every time a mafioso decides to collaborate, he is, consciously or not, walking a path that Buscetta carved out of the wilderness of fear and silence. The legal architecture built upon his testimony, particularly the concept of the mafia as a single, associational criminal entity, continues to be used to convict bosses and confiscate billions of euros in illicit assets, striking at the financial heart of the organization. Yet, his shadow also serves as a permanent warning. The murders of Falcone and Borsellino are a stark reminder of the ferocious backlash that such betrayals can provoke, a testament to the fact that the fight is never truly over and that the beast, though wounded, can still lash out with terrifying violence. Furthermore, the moral complications he embodied continue to spark debate. Is it right for the state to make deals with mass murderers? Can justice for the many truly be served by granting leniency to one who has caused so much suffering? These are questions without easy answers, and they are questions that Buscetta's life forces us to continually ask. His story is a permanent part of the Italian conscience, a dark national folktale taught in schools, analyzed in universities, and remembered every time a mafia bomb explodes or a brave magistrate takes a stand. It is a story that says as much about the nature of betrayal as it does about loyalty, about the price of vengeance as much as the cost of silence. And for the mafia itself, the name Buscetta remains the ultimate curse, a symbol of the day the walls of their secret world first began to crumble, the day one of their own decided that the only way to save his honor was to destroy them all. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey, the closing of this dark and intricate chapter, a story that began in the sun-baked streets of Palermo and ended in the silent, anonymous confines of a witness protection safe house half a world away. The tale of Tommaso Buscetta is not a simple one. It is a labyrinth of moral ambiguity, a symphony composed in a minor key, where the notes of heroism and villainy are so intertwined they become indistinguishable. He was a man who lived by a code and died by betraying that very code, all in the name of preserving its pure, idealized spirit. He was a murderer who became an instrument of justice, a traditionalist who became a revolutionary, a ghost who forever haunts the organization he once loved and ultimately crippled. His life forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that in the real world, the fight against absolute evil is rarely waged by spotless knights in shining armor. Often, it is fought with soiled hands and compromised souls, using the weapons of the enemy against them. Buscetta's weapon was knowledge, and he wielded it with the precision of a surgeon and the fury of a avenging angel. He gave the state the eyes to see the invisible enemy and the language to describe the indescribable. He turned the mafia's greatest strength, its secrecy, into its greatest vulnerability. The hundreds of convictions, the captured bosses, the confiscated fortunes, the empowered civil society, the legacy of Pentismo, all of this stands as a monument to his catastrophic decision. Yet, we must not forget the cost. We must remember the lives he took, the families he destroyed as a mafioso, and the profound personal price he paid, living out his days as a specter, severed from his homeland, forever looking over his shoulder, a king of ruins in a kingdom of ghosts. His story is a permanent testament to the fact that one man's choices, no matter how flawed or conflicted, can alter the course of history. It is a reminder that even in the most entrenched and seemingly hopeless situations, a single crack can bring down a dam. The echoes of his testimony still resonate in every Italian courtroom where a mafioso is tried, in every community that refuses the pizzo, in every citizen who chooses to stand up against the shadow of intimidation. The story of Tommaso Buscetta, the mafia's turncoat, is ultimately a story about the power of a voice, a single voice, that dared to break a silence that had lasted for centuries, and in doing so, shouted down an empire. And with that, our narrative concludes. If this journey into the heart of darkness has held your attention, if you found this story of betrayal and vengeance as compelling as we did, then we have a simple request. Help us bring more such untold stories to light. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you do not miss our next deep dive into the hidden histories that shape our world. Thank you for listening.